Well, this time last Sunday, we were all sat here very excited about the fact that the final was going to be happening that evening, an 8 p.m. kickoff, and I was here with my brand new Cross of St George waistcoat, and little did I know that when I got to Wembley at 5 o'clock, or just before 5 o'clock, and I came out of the station, I saw this crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, and there were smoke flares going off and bottles flying through the air. And if I hadn't had some pretty heavy security with me, I wouldn't have even attempted to get through that crowd. I have to say, in terms of organisation, the whole thing was dreadful. What do you think young English males are going to do on a Sunday if we have an 8 p.m. kickoff? They're going to drink, and they're going to drink to excess. They've been doing it for centuries, and you can call for cultural change all you like. It isn't going to happen quickly. I was shocked by the lack of police officers. I was shocked by the security, many of whom were my age but carrying even more pounds than I am. And it really was very, very badly organised. And I saw the storming at 5:15 of the barricades. I could scarcely believe what I was seeing. But, OK, we were there, and once inside the ground, it wasn't so bad. Quite why there was nobody at the station saying, unless you've got a ticket, please don't continue, I simply don't know. But what did happen inside the ground, of course, was a tight game, extra time, penalties. Well, of course, we all know the script, don't we? It happened in 1990, it happened in 1996. I kind of sensed an inevitability that we were going to lose on penalties. But it's what happened next that really became a story that totally dominated our news for the next 3 days, 4 days, all through the earliest part of last week. The story was that in response to 3 black footballers missing their penalties, that there was an outpouring, a mass outpouring of extreme racism, and that it proved the point that we were a truly awful country and that we should all take the knee. Well, I'm not going to dwell for the minute on taking the knee. I might do a bit more of that tomorrow when I'm back here at 7 o'clock in the evening. But the real point here is that we don't actually know who was sending these tweets, who was posting all this offensive stuff, and yet it was used in a way to denigrate, I think, the sort of feeling almost of Englishness that had developed, something that mainstream media's often felt embarrassed about. And Paul Embery, you're a big football fan. How did you feel about the aftermath of those penalties?
I mean, disappointed, of course, about the result, though, once it went to penalties. Being a long-standing England fan, I suspect we probably all knew it was only going to end in one way, and true enough, it did. In terms of the fallout that you mentioned, Nigel, I mean, I found the whole thing a bit unsettling, actually. It was almost as if we had a bit of a collective breakdown in the country over it. There were a very tiny number of people who sent racist and abusive messages to those footballers. Those people should be challenged and confronted. There's absolutely no place for that sort of thing in a civilised society. But I think the data showed that the number of messages in absolute terms was pretty tiny. Some of them apparently came from abroad. And yet the whole thing led the media for 3 days. I mean, we were obsessed about it. I say we, I think the media was obsessed about it for 3 days. And it just struck me as something that was not in keeping with what most people were seeing or hearing. I mean, it was almost as if England was gripped in some sort of race war. That was the impression that was being given by some of the reporting. And I think the unfair thing really is that of all industries that don't deserve to be tarnished as being riddled with racism, then I think English football is probably one of them. I mean, racism, of course, exists in society, but I think English football has taken huge strides in recent years to do what it can to eliminate it. And it's almost as if we've forgotten that as a nation, we're actually still one of the most tolerant and fair-minded nations on the planet. So I was unsettled by it, and I think we probably ought to have simmered it down slightly.
Yeah, there was a very, very powerful piece, intelligent piece, written in today's Sunday Times by Josh Glancy, and he makes the point that there's no audit of Twitter. We've no idea, because it's mostly anonymous accounts, but we've no idea at this stage how many of those were overseas accounts. What we do know is there was a minor audit done on Instagram, And it did show that as a percentage of the offensive posts put up by Instagram, and Instagram, by the way, apologising that their moderation hadn't stopped some of this, but of the audit that was done, only a small percentage had originated in the United Kingdom. Do you think, Dehenna, that the aftermath of this spoilt what had been quite an exciting 2 or 3 weeks?
I think it did. You know, I mean, I think any kind of racist comment put on the profiles of these players is disgraceful, as you rightly said there, Paul, and really need tackling very seriously. But I think, as you say, that this story did then dominate the headlines for 3 days. You know, we weren't talking about the great success the team had had. We weren't talking about the communities that had been brought together. We weren't talking about how the hospitality sector had done really well because of the rise of people kind of going to the pubs to watch the football, which I think is a real shame. But certainly I think there is work to do on social media with the social media companies to continue to crack down on racist abuse. And I think it was interesting here seeing Instagram actually apologising for not taking strong enough action on that moderation. I think that's definitely going to be something that's going to be discussed in the coming months with the Online Harms Bill, which is going to be coming out very soon.
When Gareth Southgate missed that penalty back in '96, something, I think, Paul, that has haunted him, really, for much of the last 25 years, social media did not, or it was completely in its infancy. Effectively, it didn't exist. Isn't the truth of it that whether the footballer that missed the penalty was black or had red hair or was short or tall or thin or fat, isn't the truth of it they would have received abuse anyway for missing a penalty?
I think they would have done, sadly. And actually, you mentioned Southgate in '96. There's probably a more striking example, which was the World Cup in 1998, where David Beckham was sent off in a second-round game for England against Argentina. And we eventually lost the game on penalties. And Beckham received dog's abuse for days and weeks. I mean, there were pictures of effigies of him being hung from lampposts. So I think regardless of the colour of their skin, I think they would have, received some level of abuse, which is sad, and there's no place for it. But it seemed to me, actually, that there were some people looking to jump on a bandwagon. I mean, there was this thing about the Marcus Rashford mural in Manchester being defaced, which it was, with some abusive language. And again, that's absolutely wrong. But all of the stories initially were that the abuse was racist, and all of a sudden we saw protest groups turning up to the mural and people arguing that the mural shouldn't have been defaced with this racist abuse. And the truth was, it was just standard unpleasant abuse. There was nothing racist about it at all. So it does strike me that some people are looking to perpetuate a race war, and it's almost the kind of import of US-style racial politics into Britain, which I think is going to be disastrous, because we are a fundamentally different country to America in that regard. And anyone who thinks that that's the answer, or that's going to bring people together, I think is going to be in for a nasty shock, frankly.
So why did so much of mainstream media perpetuate this narrative, throughout half of the last week?
I mean, I think, first of all, probably to sell newspapers, to sensationalise things, to dramatise things, to get clicks on their websites, etc. But ultimately, it's irresponsible. I think media has got a responsibility to report the truth. And if these messages are tiny in number, and if most of them, as seemed to be the case, or at least many of them were coming from abroad, that needed to be reported. And as I think Dehenna said, that what it did is it took the focus of what was a really good tournament by the England players, who conducted themselves impeccably, did ever so well to get through to the final. And that achievement was overlooked in this sensationalism in the 3 days afterwards. And I think that's really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, no, it was. Dehenna, they're going to there'll be lifetime bans given to people who sent out abuse. But do you think, and you're a big sports fan, one of the talks was, as we started to run through this tournament and do well, that there'd be a bid, a United Kingdom and Republic of Ireland bid for the 2030 World Cup. Do you think, given what we saw, and not the social media, but do you think given what we saw at Wembley the other day, are we fit to put a bid in for the 2030 World Cup?
Well, I certainly don't think it was helpful. You know, I sincerely hope that if we do submit a bid, it will still be successful. But when you see, you know, young TikTokers managing to sneak into the stadium, when you see stampedes that see Harry Maguire's dad kind of battered to the floor and left with broken ribs, I mean, clearly something went vastly wrong in terms of the stewarding. And I know we've spoken before about how now it's stewards who are more kind of untrained than specialist trained police officers, as we kind of used to see it at football games and other sports events in the past. I think we're going to have to work very hard if we do decide to really press ahead with this bid to prove that we are up to it and that we will put in place decent measures to stop anything like this from happening at any future games.
Well, it was just, I have to say, Channel 4 News reported that I had bottles thrown at me as I walked into the ground. It's not true, they were beer cans. And one of them hit me on the back of the leg. But as I say, I had some security guards with me. Otherwise, I literally would have turned around and gone back on the train, because anybody with a well-known face going through a crowd of drunk people is going to have a tough time. Paul, you know, you're a regular attender of football matches. What's your take on that total mismanagement last Sunday?
Yeah, pretty horrendous scenes, and in some respects similar to what we used to see in this country in the 1980s, really, with serious crowd disorder. And one thing that struck me, and Dehenna just picked up on it, was what I've seen over recent years attending football matches is the changeover from where it used to be uniformed police officers largely who would be there to keep control, to segregate crowds, etc. They have been more and more replaced in recent years by stewards in high visibility jerkins and coats. And with the greatest respect to these guys, I think it's pretty obvious that some of them, when push comes to shove and it starts kicking off in the way it did at Wembley, some of them are not really up to it. Some of them, we saw the footage of it, some of them were simply not able to intervene and bring people under control. So I think there's a role actually for uniformed police officers, certainly at big matches. They seem to have stepped away from those sorts of occasions, and perhaps we need to get them back involved.
Yeah, Paul, I have to say, I was there, and when I saw the 5:15 smashing down on the barriers and hundreds of people going into the stadium, those stewards did nothing. Now, you know, they're not uniformed, they have no form of protection, physical protection on them, and I had reports of members of the public being trapped under those barriers and other people helping lift those barriers off them. It's a miracle, in my view, that we didn't have something like a Hillsborough. I really mean that. It was that dangerous. There were 250,000 people, you know, packed there in Wembley Way. And we should maybe all remind ourselves that it was Stade de France in 2015, a suicide bomber was stopped from getting in.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.